This is Houshang Amir Ahmadi, a professor at Rutgers University. I'm here with Professor الهیارکنگرلو of Columbia University. And this is Lucid Horizon in Idea TV. And I believe this is the fourth program that we have had on problems of democracy in the West, as well as in the developing countries. At least we touched a little bit, although we haven't really focused on that yet. We spoke about the crisis of capitalism, the liberal capitalism, and how the liberal capitalism has in fact developed to an illiberal capitalism, moving from competition to monopoly, moving from nationalism to globalism, and moving from culture to multiculturalism and the rest of it. And then in the course of this development, we argued that that democracies have suffered in the West, becoming increasingly illiberal, in the sense that democracy have been just simply reduced to elections, as opposed to democracy taking a much broader meaning of people's governance by the people, for the people, and with the people. I think we sort of like, we have moved to the point where we argued that, that if trends continue as they are set, we will have further crises with liberal democracies in the West, and that signs of that illiberal democracies are well seen in Western Europe and in the United States as well. And this, what's happening now in Washington is an example of that illiberal democracy. Note that by illiberal democracy, we mean that the democracies now in the West are controlled or managed or governed not by the people, but by a political class, a political elite that has taken upon itself to manage the societies for the people, and to the extent that people are involved is really reduced to elections. And that's what we call illiberal. Liberalism was a much broader view of the world and the human life and societies. It meant not just free elections, a free market, competitive market, and of course equal opportunity in many ways. But unfortunately, the more these capitalist societies have become uneven, and that across classes, social groups, and so on, a group of people we call political class or political elite have taken over these governing bodies in the West. And even then, they are not doing it the right way. Tremendous political corruption, economic corruption, and economic and political monopolies. So the question really is what to do with it. If we continue with these trends, obviously, democracies will further suffer and become even more illiberal and away from the people towards just a particular small group of political elites and economic elite who control not just the levels of politics, but also economics, and that they increasingly have become also isolated from their own national and local frameworks and have become increasingly global in the sense that they operate beyond their national interests and nationalism, and they are increasingly operating on the basis of their own selfish interests, which increasingly have become global. And this global class increasingly are joining force against nationalistic and local forces. And this is certainly a very uneven struggle, because the global forces have all the of the levels of power as well as wealth and the rest of it. So tonight, we wanted to focus on what to do with it. I wanted to put this question to Professor Kangerloo. If you agree with my summary and the assessment that we are for a situation where we may in fact see more illiberal democracy and illiberalism, of course, alongside, and that's obviously something nobody wants to happen in democratic society. So the question is, what can be done? And Professor Kangerloo, please enlighten us with your deep knowledge of this subject and the studies and research that you have done.
Yes, that was a very good and concise summary of the last 3 episodes of our conversation. So we actually unpacked the problem. We know exactly what the problem is, at least within the context that you and I could really unpack it and summarize it. And now today we are hoping that we can find some solutions for the problems that we laid out in the last 3 weeks. Liberal democracy was the beacon of hope for a vast majority of people, as it liberated, entire nations, in multiple nations in Europe and the United States and around the world, Australia, Japan, and many other countries, South Korea. And suddenly we see, and we've seen in the last couple of last few years, and perhaps in the last couple of decades, that liberal democracies are confronted with some major challenges. And that major challenge, as we described it in the previous programs, was the rise of populism and polarization of societies, and polarization to the extent that we observed in the American election, in the last one and in this recent one. And ultimately, the climax of that polarization was, it showed itself in the occupation of the US Congress on January 6, 2021, that really shook the nation and the world, that such a thing could happen. A coup-like attempt by the people could happen in the beacon of democracy. And we would like to know, first of all, why it happened and how it can be avoided and how democracy can be reinforced. We also talked about the fact that we consider nationalism to be the vehicle for materialization and implementation of liberal democratic ideals. And so let's keep that in a corner of our mind. And at the same time, we are all subscribed to the merits of capitalism as a superior form of economy. And capitalism has many different attributes. One of the attributes of capitalism is profit seeking or maximizing profit. And it's perfectly justified, at least it used to be justified, that if a capitalist economy maximizes profit within a boundaries, then it can actually set shop across the boundaries in search of new markets and new profit. And that was perceived to be perfectly legitimate. And so this profit-seeking nature of capitalism has really transcended boundaries and has created an international or global economic system, a global version of capitalism. Some people call it imperialism, but imperialism really in the old Marxian terminology was referred to really the metropole, the mother of capitalist world, which was primarily referred to the United States. But now we are really up against capitalism 2.0, a global capitalism, a capitalism that transcends borders. And because it transcends borders, it keeps a large number of citizens of the first world, citizens of this capital world, unrepresented, because, you know, democracy, after all, is supposed to be representation of political representation of the economic class. And as long as there is a tight relationship between the economic class and the political representation of that class, the political representation can protect the economic and the political interests of their constituents, and everything would be hanky-dory. Until the point comes that representations and the representatives of these constituents suddenly find a new clientele, the CEOs of the big corporations who fund their campaigns, and they really, these political representatives, they don't really need their constituents as far as campaigning is concerned, as long as their support for assuming office is concerned. So suddenly the clientele of the political system and the political representatives move from constituency to the political elite and to the international globalist elite. And these globalist elites were single-handedly and exclusively seeking profit and power. I think this is the process through which the middle class and the lower class was alienated. They felt like they are working, but they are not going anywhere. Wages have remained stagnant for more than 3 decades. And all the plights and all the appeals and pleas of the working class was left unanswered by the political representatives. And that's why, you know, in the 2016 elections, they decided to throw out the rascals and throw out the candidates, the elite candidate and the establishment candidate, which was Hillary Clinton, and bring in a newcomer, someone who sounded like, and it felt like it connected to them. At least it was talking about, you know, the issues that they were suffering from, the issues of immigration and the issues of job loss. I mean, we are not really arguing here that, you know, the job loss was due to the immigration, but that was a simple-minded association that, you know, these people made with, as associating their economic plights and their loss and unemployments as to the presence of immigrations. And these simple solutions, these simple-minded solutions that was handed to a vast majority of the lower class and the middle class by these populist candidates was extremely appealing, and that really gave rise to the emergence of populism in Europe and the United States. And now this populism is now finding new voices, even though in 2020 elections, an establishment candidate, Joe Biden, was elected to office. Still, I think voices of people like Donald Trump and Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen have a lot to say in the future, and the division of the society is an urgent issue that remains to be addressed, and we need to address that issue and see how we can really, number one, really cross this gap, bridge this gap between the two poles of the society, and how we can bring the political interest of the neglected class, the middle class and the lower class, to the table, and see how we can really bring the political representations in the United States, the democratic establishments, out of cahoots with the globalists across the world and around the world, and back into a relationship and resonance with their constituents to be able to stabilize our democracy.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very good summary on top of what I had said. It really complemented very well what I had to say about what we have done. Let me just put what you said And what I said in a different perspective, as we said that the capitalism developed in nations. So therefore, capitalism was nation-based, local-based, and largely nation-based, that it happened in certain countries. And capitalism was a very productive force, and it generated a middle class very quickly. And that middle class really took upon itself to advocate and seek democracy. Democracy is largely a middle class issue. The working class and the lower class usually is after the basic needs, and the upper class is after accumulation of wealth and so on. It's the middle class that usually has enough to live, and that it doesn't see itself like at the global level or big level. So they advocate democracy so that they can talk, they can write and have other freedoms. So that's a very important observation. I believe that we should not forget that democracy is largely a middle class issue, is a middle class demand, and that it has been advocated and continues to be advocated by the middle class. Now, in the course of capitalism's development, this national productive system gradually became more concentrated and centralized in the hands of a few, monopolies, trust systems, and so on. And that national capitalism, in a way, became increasingly imperialistic, in the sense that it started seeking markets elsewhere. They did not see the national markets satisfying them, so they started looking into the markets beyond the nations for both the commodity markets, labor markets, the capital markets, and the rest of it. But imperialism was still nation-based. That is to say, imperialism still was at the highest stage of capitalism in a particular country. Like US imperialism meant that US capitalism has outgrown its borders. Now it's interacting, selling in other countries, and so on and so forth. And that the same thing happened to the others, at other countries and other capitalist systems. But one thing that in the course of this development happened was very different from just national capitalism becoming more concentrated and centralized and expanding beyond the borders. What happened here, that in the course of this development, a new class of capitalists developed, that their interest became very much the same. They began sharing in interest. Under imperialism, there wasn't a shared interest between this imperialist, so-called, that is that class or that business that had expanded beyond the US border or UK border or what. And in fact, not only they did not have a shared interest, they indeed involved in wars. The first and the second World War were indeed wars that imperialist forces imposed on the world for redividing the world, so-called. But in the course of that development, as I said, this new phenomena developed, and that is that this larger bigger companies, larger companies and owners, and the guys who, not only just own them, but also control and manage them, they increasingly developed across the globe, across the world. They began developing shared interests. And instead of fighting each other, they began cooperating with each other. They realized that their destiny, their future is in cooperation as opposed to fighting. So they started developing a whole new global system that will manage their problems as well as the problem of the nations that they controlled. We got into the United Nations, we got into the World Bank, IMF, and so many other global organizations that for the first time, they now are trying to sort of like manage the common interests of the global players. And that's where globalism developed. That is to say, globalism is really not just a continuation of imperialism. It is a completely different phenomenon. This is where a new class of global actors start thinking of shared interests and building institutions, ideas, practices, policies that will serve that common interest. So they came increasingly together. So, but the more this class got together at the global level, at the international level, the more they isolated themselves from the national and local. So they, in sort of like, out of that, a reaction developed. And that's nationalistic reaction, populism, and the rest of it. That they saw that class, alliance globally against their national and local interests. So, in fact, what I am saying perhaps is that that this democracy that was born out of the liberal philosophy of the 18th century onward, and then with capitalism it grew, and then with the emergence of middle class, it became a serious way of thinking about how to manage. Unfortunately, in the course of this development that I just said, from national capitalism to imperialism, and then suddenly to a completely new, qualitatively different global system, lost this movement or lost the control over managing their societies, and that the societies became increasingly managed by those political class, that elite, who had increasingly become global and isolated from national and local. Now, what this really, of course, people like Donald Trump's solution to this was that we need to actually control that global capitalists and capitalism, and then make them increasingly, again, national, that we have to rebuild nations, we have to rebuild localities. And then, so then this nation, the rebuilt nation, the rebuilt capitalism, national capitalism, the rebuilt local capitalism will further generate a new middle class that in the course of this global development has lost. So this new middle class then supposedly will sort of reinvent democracy on the national basis and so on. What this suggests is perhaps, I don't know, I mean, again, I want to give this thing to you, that perhaps, but because we are talking about solution, what to do, and I think what certainly certain nationalistic leaders, populist leaders are thinking is that the way to basically save democracy is to rebuild national capitalism, nationalism, localism, local capitalism, and increasingly, militate against global forces by devising policies that will increasingly limit that big force, that global force, and save, serve, and expand these national forces. Though, and of course, that means that there is a serious fight here to be done. That is, I mean, as we saw in the case of Trump, in action, all right, it wasn't easy because, as we saw, global forces reorganized and fought back, and they fought back seriously, and they had, unfortunately, they had every means to fight back, and had more. They had power, they had wealth, they had the media, the propaganda machines, from the social media to this, traditional media. They had all of it. So they fought back. Now, here I may add just one observation, and then let you take over. I believe another reason that when democracy suffered in advanced capitalist worlds is that, unfortunately, a good majority of people in these societies, because of the propaganda that were coming from those upper class medias, they were increasingly miseducated, de-educated, and became increasingly sort of like shallow, what I say, that became peoples of three lines, the social media and so on. So they lost that depth of understanding that they used to have. Even middle class suffered from that phenomenon. Even university professors suffered from that phenomenon, and others. And next to that, de-education, miseducation, we also saw a different kind of education that increasingly de-emphasized on social liberal education toward more technical, skilled education, because those guys needed a skill. They didn't need philosophers. They did not need theoreticians. They needed people to do their work. So, on the one hand, the education went back from the liberal democracy, liberal sort of education, social education, towards those skills and so on, technology and the rest. But at the same time, they fed these people with, as Trump used to say, fake news and fake analysis, and making them increasingly shallow in their
and that's why we're here. That's why we are here to actually.
That's right, and that is the major problem. That is a big problem, because I think the biggest problem that we face everywhere in the world is that the people's understanding is no more that complex that it used to be. You know, very shallow, three-line people. We have developed so many. And think about it. The global forces have convince the poor people in this country, the United States, that they represent their interests, that those people who are calling for nationalism, for America first, do not represent their interests. Just think about it.
And I think that's why we have to really define some terms. Here we are talking about a few terminologies that I think we have to make sure that we will pin it down before we go any further. So we talk about nationalism, we talk about capitalism, and we talk about globalism, and we want to know exactly what these things are and what's the relationship between, and then on top of all of this, we talked about liberal democracy as the highest achievement of capitalism. So, you know, we can at least agree on a few things. We can agree that the health of an economic system is the size of its middle class. In other words, the purchasing power of middle class, the political freedom of middle class, the social contribution of the middle class, and the liveliness and the livelihood of what's considered the middle class, and as the larger the size of
the quality of the middle class's
and
education,
the quality of their lives, and the quality of life, which is directly dependent on their education. So as long as so globalism, let's make sure that, you know, we both agree on this. Globalism is nothing new. I mean, just like you mentioned, as soon as capital started flying across the border, moving to other lands in search of more profit, or perhaps in a benevolent form in search of development of the less developed countries, I mean, that was really an early and primitive form of capitalism, and has been going on since capitalism has been in existence. But as long as I'm going to call this form of globalism as globalism 1.0, the globalism that stayed confined within the capitalist world. You know, for instance, you know, you and I remember that during the Shah, during the Pahlavis, a lot of American companies came to Iran, they set up shop, and, you know, they produced goods, cars and refrigerators and TVs, and, you know, everything was fine. Iran never emerged as an enemy of the United States. It never, at least the Iran of the Pahlavis, never contested the United States economy. It never claimed a superpower status. It never challenged the political aspirations of the United States. The same thing is true about every other country in which the United States or Europeans invested. During World War II, you know, Germany was torn down to rebels and to rebels, and then the same thing is true with Japan and Italy. But the United States actually reinvested through the Marshall Plan, and it really helped Germany to rise from among its rubbles, and Germany built the kind of economy that we know it was capable of building in a matter of 2 decades. But Germany never contested the United States, at least maybe in the context of the peace accord, post-World War II arrangement. Germany was never allowed to have a massive military buildup. But somehow, in our globalization 2.0, when capitals flight to China specifically, they somehow dropped the ball. They forgot about the fact that they need to put some limits on the appetite and the desire and aspiration of this country, this destination country where the capital and technology and science is flowing and is empowering that country. And so we suddenly gave rise after 1975 and after Nixon and Kissinger's opening to China, we started an entirely different type of profit-seeking policies, if we want to call it that. The type of profit-seeking policy, the type of globalization, which kind of dropped its guards with respect to the excessive empowerment of the country in which the capital is flowing into. And by the time that perhaps, you know, we were all intoxicated by the implosion of socialism, by the implosion of communism. And between 1975, where, you know, we opened to China, and 1989, when Soviet Union collapsed, that was only 14, 15 years. And within these 14, 15 years, we were engaged with a number of issues: the Iranian Revolution, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and us, America's engineering of Russians, enticing Russians into getting trapped in the Afghanistan battleground and the killing fields of Afghanistan. And all of this really made us not really focus our eyes on the ball, and we really dropped the ball by allowing massive amount of capital and technology to fly into China. And by the time we came to ourselves, China was really contesting us, and it was on its way to become the second largest economy. And now it's on its way to become the largest economy, the first economy in the world that does not represent a capitalism combined with liberal democracy. And now, to make the matters worse, there are some aspiring China-like development style who are hoping, some third world dictators who are hoping to mimic and emulate the Chinese model. In other words, keep the politics in the hands of the despots and dictators, but liberalize the economy and benefit from the economic fallouts of the miracles of capitalism. Specifically, Vietnam is taking foot in the footsteps of China, and it has made a great stride. Probably a lot of companies that, as a result of Donald Trump's presidency, they cannot continue doing business as usual with China. Now they're moving their shops from China to Vietnam, and now, interesting enough, Islamic Republic in Iran also is really encouraged and emboldened by the Chinese success, and they're hoping that they can actually, in alliance with China, they can continue challenging the United States and threaten the interests of the United States in the region. And because of the fact that still the political establishment in the United States is really subscribed to the Cold War mentality, they are inadvertently or overtly they are empowering and they're accommodating the Islamic Republic. I mean, we saw that the Iranians were so disheartened as a result of the election of Joe Biden and the failure of Donald Trump for his second bid for presidency. And that's exactly addressed to that issue. I think the fact that that some political elites in cahoots with the economic elite, with the CEOs of the big corporations, they made profit-seeking synonymous with the national interests, and as a result, they didn't see the threats of China, the economic threat of China, and now that economic threat is combined with the military threat. All of that has really challenged our livelihood, and it has really enhanced and it has aggravated some of the political divisions, alienation of the middle class, and the fact that, like I said at the beginning, the political representation, those who are classically representatives of the middle class are now more inclined in whining and dining with the CEOs of big corporations in order to ensure the re-election, and they're less concerned with the plight of the middle class. All of this has really resulted in the crisis of capitalism, and we are hoping that through education, through understanding of all these different mechanisms of liberal democracy's relationship with nationalism, the globalization 1.0 and globalization 2.0, and multinationalism and the fading of the national borders, and the bad rap that nationalism has gotten. And it has sometimes been made synonymous with racism and fascism, something that really is absolutely unfair, an analogy that's unfair to make. And I think the best way that we can bring this economy and this society back on track and reduce the tension between the different groups and start a dialogue, an interesting dialogue, and a dialogue based on economic interests, is through education and through better understanding of these issues. And I think that's exactly what we're hoping to achieve in these programs.
Yeah, I think I would call it the agitating education as opposed to just neutral education, because the other side, the global forces are not just strong, they are extremely vocal and forceful in preserving and furthering their interests. Let me summarize, not summarize, let me just add something on top of what you just said, or maybe conclude from that. It seems to me like there was a time when there were national interests, and there was the interest of the United States versus the interest of China versus the interest of India or Britain or so on and so forth. The global development and the development of these global forces have indeed brought into question the relevance of this national interest, or more broadly, nationalism in that way. Meaning they are telling the people in any nation, every nation, that it doesn't matter you are a very nationalist American. What really matters is that you are a player among these global players and compete there and see what happens. And obviously we know what happens. The global forces, those guys who are advocating this, will become richer and richer. And we also know that the local forces and national forces are going to increasingly stay behind. Now, so therefore, I think the fight here, in my view, is rightly globalism versus nationalism. And I tell you why the globalism and nationalism is the key here, because, as I said, that's where the interest has moved from, the interest of the people. And that interest includes democracy, it includes food, it includes shelter, it includes job, everything. But so now the education that we are talking about needs to really focus on this particular what I call dualism, the dualism of global versus national. Now, unfortunately, as I said, the global forces, because they are so powerful, they have so much media and everything else, they have hollowed out the world in terms of not just education and understanding, but everything else, nationalism and so on. What that means is that they have tried to clean up minds that had, for example, American nationalism in there, and making them to think increasingly global. Now, increasingly global means hollow, because honestly, hardly any middle-class American has any idea of what that global is. That's just the case with every other force. The global understanding is a monopoly of the global force. The local forces, the national forces, have no understanding of what actually is going out there. They can't even, they have made the news fake, they have made the analysis fake, they have filled in minds at the national level and local level with lots of junks that resemble anything but education, good understanding, a good grasp of the reality of their own life. Again, that's why I believe the globalists in the US were they were easily able to get 80 million people behind them. I can promise you, of the 80 million that voted for global forces here, 50 million have absolutely zero interest in global forces and globalization. They are poor people, they are working class people, they are, the Afro-Americans, they're Hispanic, there are all kinds of, unfortunately, people at the lower end of the society, but they are hollowed out. They are hollowed out in the sense that they have become empty boxes. You know, hollowing out means, you know, you see Hushan, but really Hushan has been emptied. It is nothing in his mind. There's nothing in his, you know, eyes. He just sees what the global forces wanted that want him to see. So I think we need to fight against this hollowing out of individuals and national and local societies.
I think the best way that we can do that is by defining what is national interest, because every government is receiving representation, is receiving the right to sovereignty from its nations, at least in the West, in the democratic countries, through democratic means. And when they receive representation and the right to use the national sovereignty rights, they must agree in a social contract that they will protect the national interest. And now the question is, what is the national interest? Is the national interest of the United States in maximizing the quality of life for as many people as possible? Can we define the national interest in that? Or the national interest is in maximizing the profits of American corporations, hoping or assuming that those corporations will bring those profits back into the United States, back into the country, and help establishing that original goal of maximizing the quality of life of Americans. I think there has been a disconnection between these two sets of values. We have, I think, at least in the last 3 decades, in the last 4 decades, we have made the national interest of the United States synonymous with the national interest of corporations. So if the top 20, 30, 40, 50 corporations are posting profit and the stock market is posting increase and healthy growth, then we make that synonymous with the national interest, notwithstanding the fact that all that profit making, all that growth, all that economic growth is really being funneled in the hands of a few corporations who are parking all these funds in some offshore bank account, and they're not really allowing it to benefit the average American people, and average American people have been left out in the cold. I think that disconnection, the disconnection between maximizing the quality of life of American people as an ultimate criteria of the national interest compared to maximizing the profits of the big corporations, especially the corporations who have have major investments overseas, and not really looking into how the profits of those corporations are being worked back and brought back into this country and is being spent in improving the quality of life of Americans. I think that disconnection has alienated people. That disconnection has really alienated a large number of people, as average Americans seeing that their political representations are being insensitive to their plight. They are, as long as they can raise funds for their re-elections, they are really not paying much attention to the plights of the people. The fact that the manufacturing capabilities of these countries are completely hollowed out, and they're shipped overseas, and jobs are lost. At least the manufacturing jobs are lost by the tons every year and every decade in this country, and nobody is really paying any attention. And politicians are just busy making out with the corporate leaders, and they're completely insensitive to the plight of the people. I think education of the average Americans about the connection between the maximizing the quality of life and the profit making, and not making the profit making of the big corporations synonymous with the national interest of the United States, goes a long way to healing the wounds of the last 40 years and rebuilding America and rebuilding the manufacturing infrastructure in this country, which is the biggest source of value-added economy, and we are in dire need of doing that. And I'm hoping that through programs like this, we can help that happen.
Very, very well said. Okay, let me take it from there and move a little bit further. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. The key, of course, that one thing that runs through the whole thing in our or the society's fight for a better life, let's say, is education. So education is the job number one here. The question is, we need to educate who and how and about what. You said that we need to focus on national interests. Very good. Now, let me say, before, national interests used to be, in the past, the interest of the United States versus China, United States versus UK. That was sort of in the old international sort of relationship theories or IR theories. The national interest really means the interest of this nation against that nation. All right, the interest here basically means economic interests. Now, as we said, unfortunately, increasingly, that national interest has changed. That old national interest, that definition doesn't hold anymore, because the national interest of the United States has become synonymous to the interest of their global forces, their monopolies. And these monopolies have the same interest, common interest, with the interests of those global forces in other nations. So the very concept of national interest needs to change, and there has to be a re-education of what national interest is. Indeed, perhaps we have to more specifically first educate people about what a nation is. When we say nation, which then nationalism derives from it and national interest derives from it, what it is. Well, a nation, of course, has a bunch of people. It has a geography and environment and so on. And it has a government. It has, culture and civilization, and it has international relations. Now, this, I think, what national interest of a nation, therefore, is that that nation needs to maximize its interest in all of these areas, not just in international relations. That's the old way of looking at the national interest. Your national interest means that your people's interest versus the people's interest in China has to be preserved, that your economic interest, your political interest, your environmental interest, your cultural interest, and so on. So there has to be a broader definition of nation and nationalism and national interest. And my hope is that at least it will have these 5 dimensions and more, perhaps. That's number one. The second, we need to say, well, okay, let's take any of this. Let's take economic. Let's take politics. What's happening? You have to tell people, listen, American national economy, which was capitalism, over the last 40 years, for example, hasn't been performing well and increasingly performing less, weaker. Now, we have to explain, educational-wise, why that is the case, what happened. For example, we talked about the fact that the other countries took American technology and science and commercialized and returned it to America. America became the godfather of the globe, the global community after World War II, and it paid for all of this. And there were all kinds of problems that we discussed in the past. But what happened to politics? Our politics also became globalized, and this not only globalized, but corrupt. That the political elite became increasingly allies. They became allies of economic elites that were operating globally. So the political elite also developed, alongside the economic elite, a global interest. beyond the American national interest. So that's another problem. We have to tell them that this Congress, the Senate, this White House and other places, they are now sort of like a part of the global community of elites globally. Okay, therefore we have to educate them that that cannot serve American national interests, because American national interests will require nationalistic elite, not globalistic elite. Very by definition, right? You want to serve American interests, you have to be an American nationalist. You cannot be a globalist that will be looking after the interest of that global force, meaning those people who come from everywhere and they have, allied with each other in a force called global. Next, we need to also explain to the people what's happening to the other classes in the society, not just the global class, that is a political elite or economic elite, but what's happening to the middle class, to the working class, and so on. And we will see that the middle class and the working class are also losing as the economic system loses and as political class becomes more global and corrupt. So that's a major way to educate, and then to educate them about why these people can't see the fact, the reality. Why can't they see that their economic situation is declining, so the middle class and the working class are declining, but at the same time that the economy at the national level is declining, certain economic elite and political elite, not only they are not declining, they are growing.
That's the conflict between corporate interests and national interests.
Exactly. So here is now the question, Professor Kangerloo, is why can't people see it? I think here is where we talk about media. We talk about, as Mr. Trump said, fake news, fake analysis, the hollowing out of the people, making people a three-line people. The middle class and others, they have become, in social media, there's only three line. Twitter doesn't allow you beyond certain numbers, like that's it, boards. That hollows the analysis. There is no analysis into it. It just, you put the thing in it, it goes, and then people take it, whether right or wrong.
Well, unfortunately, we are coming to an end, a couple of minutes, and I want you to wrap up.
So I just wanted to finalize this and conclude saying that our education, the project really has to focus on educating people about what's happening to their national definition, to their national interest, to the economic elites, the political elites, the middle class, the working class, and more importantly, to the media, and how the media is hollowing them out, and how the media is miseducating them and de-educating them, okay, making believe that what is happening is in their best interest, while that is not in their best interest or in the best interest of the nation. It is only in the best interest of that global force. That's where our education has to focus.
Yes, exactly, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. And we are going to, in the future programs, we are going to pick it up from there and see how we can help people in a very simple language to make a distinction between corporate interest, national interest, globalism, the new globalism 2.0, globalism 1.0, and whether this return of capital back to United States and decoupling from the China's economy is really a solution, and how we can establish a dialogue among these different poles of this very polarized society in order to reduce the tension and bring America back on its path to the great country that it has always been, and we're hoping to make a little contribution to make it again. Thank you very much, Dr. Amir Ahmadi, and I think we are going to end here and meet with our audience in the next program. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoyed it.